Part 2. Let us now amplify the nature of situation by providing a formal definition and examining constituents. Rhetorical situation may be defined as a complex of persons, events, objects, and relations presenting an actual or potential exigence, which can be completely or partially removed if discourse introduced into the situation can so constrain human decision or action as to bring about the significant modification of the exigence. Prior to the creation and presentation of discourse, there are three constituents of any rhetorical situation. The first is the exigence. The second and third are elements of the complex, namely the audience to be constrained in decision and action, and the constraints which influence the rhetor and can be brought to bear upon the audience. Any exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency. It is a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. In almost any sort of context, there will be numerous exigencies, but not all are elements of a rhetorical situation. Not all are rhetorical exigencies. An exigence which cannot be modified is not rhetorical. Thus, whatever comes about of necessity and cannot be changed, death, winter, and some natural disasters, for instance, are exigencies, to be sure, but they are not rhetorical. Further, an exigence which can be modified only by means other than discourse is not rhetorical. Thus, an exigence is not rhetorical when its modification requires merely one's own action or the application of a tool, but neither requires nor invites the assistance of discourse. An exigence is rhetorical when it is capable of positive modification and when positive modification requires discourse or can be assisted by discourse. For example, suppose that a man's acts are injurious to others, and that the quality of his acts can be changed only if discourse is addressed to him. The exigence, his injurious acts, is then unmistakably rhetorical. The pollution of our air is also a rhetorical exigence because its positive modification, reduction of pollution, strongly invites the assistance of discourse, producing public awareness, indignation, and action of the right kind. Frequently, rhetors encounter exigences which defy easy classification because of the absence of information, enabling precise analysis and certain judgment. They may or may not be rhetorical. An attorney whose client has been convicted may strongly believe that a higher court would reject his appeal to have the verdict overturned, but because the matter is uncertain, because the exigence might be rhetorical, he elects to appeal. In this and similar instances of indeterminate exigences, the rhetor's decision to speak is based mainly upon the urgency of the exigence and the probability that the exigence is rhetorical. In any rhetorical situation, there will be at least one controlling exigence, which functions as the organizing principle. It specifies the audience to be addressed and the change to be effected. The exigence may or may not be perceived clearly by the rhetor or other persons in the situation. It may be strong or weak, depending upon the clarity of their perception and the degree of their interest in it. It may be real or unreal, depending on the facts of the case. It may be important or trivial. It may be such that discourse can completely remove it, or it may persist in spite of repeated modifications. It may be completely familiar, one type of exigence is occurring frequently in our experience, or it may be totally new, unique. When it is perceived and when it is strong and important, Then it constrains the thought and action of the perceiver, who may respond rhetorically if he is in a position to do so. The second constituent is the audience. Since rhetorical discourse produces change by influencing the decision and action of persons who function as mediators of change, it follows that rhetoric always requires an audience, even in those cases when a person engages himself or ideal mind as audience. It is clear also that a rhetorical audience must be distinguished from a body of mere hearers or readers. Properly speaking, a rhetorical audience consists only of those persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. Neither scientific nor poetic discourse requires an audience in the same sense. Indeed, neither requires an audience in order to produce its end. The scientist can produce a discourse expressive or generative of knowledge without engaging another mind, and the poet's creative purpose is accomplished when the work is composed. It is true, of course, that scientists and poets present their works to audiences, but their audiences are not necessarily rhetorical. The scientific audience consists of persons capable of receiving knowledge, and the poetic audience of persons capable of participating in aesthetic experiences induced by the poetry. But the rhetorical audience must be capable of serving as mediator of the change which the discourse functions to produce. Besides exigence and audience, every rhetorical situation contains a set of constraints made up of persons, events, objects, and relations, which are parts of the situation because they have the power to constrain decision and action needed to modify the exigence. Standard sources of constraint include beliefs, attitudes, documents, facts, traditions, images, interests, motives, and the like. And when the orator enters the situation, his discourse not only harnesses constraints given by situation, but provides additional important constraints. For example, his personal character, his logical proofs, and his style. There are two main classes of constraints: those originated or managed by the rhetor and his method. Aristotle called these artistic proofs, for instance, ethos, logos, and pathos. And two, those other constraints in the situation which may be operative, Aristotle's inartistic proofs. Both classes must be divided so as to separate those constraints that are proper from those that are improper. These three constituents, exigence, audience, constraints, comprise everything relevant to a rhetorical situation. When the orator, invited by situation, enters it and creates and presents discourse, then both he and his speech are additional constituents.